Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm Karan Takhar, and today I chat with Amy Harder, founding executive editor of Cipher. We discuss her path to climate journalism, how Cipher covers energy issues objectively, and what makes technical topics accessible. Amy also shares her take on policy shifts and advice for aspiring climate journalists. Hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, it's me again. Just a quick heads up. This interview with Amy Harder was recorded back in November, but I still believe many of her insights are still super relevant. So sit back, enjoy, and thank you for listening. Hello, Amy. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. It is phenomenal to have you on. I've been following your work and am truly inspired by your writing and really looking forward to just diving into your journey, learning more about Cipher, what your vision is for the organization. And before getting into it, through my research, I learned that you're an avid runner and cross-country skier. Super cool. I'm curious, how have these hobbies impacted or shaped your passion for climate and energy reporting, if at all? Have they always been a part of your life?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me on here. It's exciting to be joining you for this good conversation. So I have been a runner pretty much my whole life. I will say, though, in high school and college, I was running around a track. But since then, I've really swapped the track for the trees and the trails, and whether I'm cross country skiing or trail running, that really is my happy place. And it really does help provide some context for the type of journalism that I do, which, as I know we'll get into, I lead a mission-driven journalism outlet called Cipher News. And, when I'm running in the forest here in Washington State where I live, it helps remind me that this is, not to be too cheesy about it, but this is part of what we're protecting. Now, it's not the only thing we're protecting. We're also protecting cities and livelihoods and other things, but nature is a core part of it. And so it just kind of simplifies it for me. In the meditation world, there's a word called forest bathing. And when I'm running in the trees in the rain, I really think about that a lot. So it is definitely a connection that I make on a pretty regular basis.
I love that. Wait, what was the term that you referenced to in the meditation world? Forest what?
Forest bathing.
Oh, cool.
I first heard it on this meditation app called Calm by a meditation expert named Jay Shetty. I don't know if that's the right title for him, but nonetheless, he talks about it. And it's just where you go out into a forest and you soak up the sounds and the feelings of a forest. And when you're running in the rain, you really get to feel a lot. So.
Yeah, I bet. I feel like the other day, so I went rock climbing, and this was one of my first times really going rock climbing. And I'm hooked. It's like so fun, but also just being outside in nature with like people who are, passionate about climbing and just like generally being in that environment. So highly resonate. Are there any like particularly insightful or like impactful cross-country skiing experiences that come to mind for you? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, well, I'm a runner first, skier second, definitely an amateur cross-country skier. But I will say, this is probably not what you were thinking I would say, but I go skiing, cross-country skiing in Snoqualmie Pass here in Washington State. And sometimes I can hear snowmobiles in trails nearby, and they are so loud and obnoxious. And you can smell the noxious fumes as well coming from the exhaustion of these snowmobiles. So, there is a little bit of efforts happening for electric snowmobiles. And I'm all for that because when I'm skiing out in nature, the last thing I want to hear is a very loud engine. So, as much fun as I'm sure it is to be on a snowmobile, I have never been. They disrupt my peaceful cross country skiing. So that's my hot take of the day. And yeah, so, +1 for electric snowmobiles.
Electric. Honestly, I feel like those would be really fun to drive too. Probably like great acceleration. That's it's an idea I might have to get behind. And now shifting gears slightly, thank you for sharing about your extremely cool hobbies. So, as a journalist, you've covered a really wide spectrum of energy topics throughout your career, from fracking to clean tech solutions. What initially drew you to reporting on energy and climate? And how's your perspective evolved on climate journalism over the years?
I really fell into energy and climate reporting by a happy accident. I was working at a publication in Washington, D.C. called National Journal. And my editor at the time said that, they needed help managing an online discussion forum. I think we called them blogs back in those days. That was around 2008 and 9. And that's when I just happened to fall into the topic. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't have any preconceived interest in the topic. That's really changing now, where younger people in college and even younger are finding passion in this topic. I just fell into it, which is great. Everybody can have different paths to their lives and their careers. And so I fell into it, and I just found it so endlessly fascinating. There's so, and this is probably true for a lot of topics, but particularly energy and climate change. Even those two words, energy and climate change, both of those things represent massive beats and topics in and of themselves. I've really tried to focus on the intersection of the two. But I will say that in my first several years covering the beat, at National Journal and then going to the Wall Street Journal based in Washington, D.C., I was really energy first. I traveled the country to cover the fracking boom. I've been to North Dakota and Colorado and California, where there's a lot of oil and gas production, largely facilitated by fracking, that really revolutionized the way we do energy. Excuse me, the way we do fossil fuels, oil and natural gas in particular, here in the United States. But that evolved to embrace more and more climate concerns. And it really took another level when Donald Trump won the election the first time around in 2016. And then I went to Axios, and my coverage really shifted to include climate change as well as then President Trump and now President-elect Trump uh, really disavowed climate science. And so the beat has really evolved over the last decade, and my beat has as well.
That's amazing. And we're definitely going to get to hearing your perspective on how you think the landscape is going to develop over these next few years, which I'm really excited to hear your perspective on. As it pertains to your role while you were traveling to cover fracking and then evolving into Axios, what does your journalism process look like? And how has that evolved? I feel like you were someone who has been reporting for many years now, and diving right into the fracking boom, that's like a super interesting time to be getting involved on the energy reporting side. So I'd love to just get some lessons learned from your incredible experience during that time.
Yeah, certainly, and really being on the ground talking to people is so important to the reporting that any reporter does. And so that's a core focus of the Cipher team as well, which maybe we'll get to. But one thing that I think is so important is to talk to all sides of an issue. So, for example, a series of stories I did in Colorado, which is a major oil and gas producing state, but it's also a very purple and increasingly blue state from a political perspective. So on the one hand, I would go out to an oil and gas site by an oil and gas company and talk to the executives. And then on the other hand, I would go to the home of somebody whose house is now 400 feet from an oil and gas well and who has deep concerns about that. And then I call up a professor at the local university to get some additional context. And so, really being humble about the topic, even though I know a lot, I'm also confident enough to be humble about the things I will never fully know. And so that's why coming into these conversations with some humility, talking to all sides of a story is really important. And that's something that I do still now as I lead a team. That's something that I'm constantly reinforcing with them and making sure that we do that.
Are there any specific tactics that you use in order to get access to sources?
I think, for example, having good connections with national trade associations is really important because oftentimes when you go into a local community, they may not trust you or may not know you as well. So getting reinforcing, hey, this reporter is a fair reporter. They're going to talk to you with respect and be polite, which is important, right? Because the media, we don't exactly have the best reputation these days. So going above and beyond to build the trust of your sources is really important. Now, that doesn't mean you write puff pieces that everybody loves. You write fair pieces. And I think that's one thing that I'm proud of and that I'm proud of our team as well at Cipher is that we write fair stories that are polite and constructive, but they're also pointing out the criticisms that are appropriate to make. And so I think making sure you have a source network that's very comprehensive to the point where if an oil and gas executive in Denver isn't particularly sure of who you are or if you're worth trusting, I can go to the American Petroleum Institute, who I've worked with for many, many years, to say, hey, can you tell this person that I'm worth talking to. That's just a specific example that I'm not sure if I used back in the day, but it's somewhat relevant for today because Trump's energy secretary nominee is Chris Wright, who is an executive of a fracking company based in Colorado.
As the executive editor at Cipher, do you still engage in hands-on reporting, or is your role now primarily focused more on shaping the broader editorial direction of Cipher?
One thing that I love about my job is every day is different. And I would say overall, compared to a few years ago, my reporting has definitely dropped. But there's still times that I dive in with my reporting and writing. And importantly, I'm helping to strengthen and shape the stories of our team. And so even if I'm not on the ground, and for example, we have our chief Europe correspondent, Anka Gurzu, was on the ground in Baku, Azerbaijan for the United Nations Climate Conference. She was there and she did amazing coverage, and I was able to help strengthen her reporting there, even though I wasn't there. So it's really been a fun, unique challenge for me to sort of shift away from just doing reporting to doing some reporting and also leading a team. But I certainly have an endless list of story ideas that I'm sure someday I will get back to reporting.
Yeah, how do you actually decide on which topics ultimately get covered? I feel like there's so many potential ideas to dive into. What does that process look like for you?
It's certainly one that we think about a lot because there are a lot of things that can fit under the energy and climate umbrella. Cipher News is really focused on climate solutions, so that's one way that we really zero our focus. We also try to cover things that are not getting as much coverage in other media outlets. For example, electric cars get a lot of attention, so we cover them a little bit less. And we cover, for example, carbon capture and direct air capture and things like clean steel. We try to cover those topics a little bit more because they get less coverage in the media. And so that's how we at Cipher writ large sort of pick and choose what we write about. For me personally, I try to do two types of stories. One where it's sort of a trend piece where I'm linking and connecting a lot of pieces. And one article I did earlier this year is looking at how ever since the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August of 2022, we've really entered an era of debating how to address climate change instead of whether to address climate change. I will say now that Trump is in office again, that question is it's more of an open question now. But I'm still pretty confident in this idea that the energy transition is happening. It's just a matter of the pace at which we're moving. So looking at trends and connecting a couple of different dots, those are that's one type of story. And then another one would be kind of distilling an important concept for one. So this one was about how we can't sacrifice our way out of climate change. And I interviewed Matt Rogers. He's the CEO of this company called Mill. And it's this company that puts in basically compost garbage in your kitchen so that it can compost the food and then distill it down to dry food that could eventually be turned into chicken feed or something. And it's a way to save on the amount of food you're throwing away, but it's also a way to help combat climate change. And so for me, I was looking at how can we save the planet while also making benefits for humanity, because humanity has never sacrificed anything for anything long term. We saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are two types of stories that I've been pursuing for my perch as leading Cipher.
Got it. And speaking of Trump, it's almost impossible to talk about climate or clean energy today without trying to understand how a Trump presidency will impact the field. And you mentioned how previously you have done like a decent amount of reporting on fracking, and then you transitioned to Axios, which, as I understand it, was also under Trump's first term. So are there any lessons learned from that experience that you feel like might translate over to this term? Or do you feel as if this term will be completely different from that term as it pertains to orientation, or like not completely different? Or are there ways that you think it will be different?
I think by and large, it will be more similar than different. I think the differences will be in effective execution on behalf of sort of administrative things throughout the administration. This isn't their first go around. They've worked out the kinks, so they'll be more effective in all areas. And depending on where you sit in the political realm, that could be good or bad. But so there's that. I will be looking to see where if to what degree climate science becomes a live football again. It did not as much as perhaps some people thought in the last term. Trump did pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we can anticipate that he will do that again. But whether or not he goes a step further to try to really undercut climate science, certainly we saw some of that, but we didn't, for example, see him go after the Environmental Protection Agency endangerment finding, or he didn't pull out of the UN, the underlying UN climate treaty. So those are some things that I will be wondering to what degree he will try to go after that. And if he does, that could be, pretty damaging to the overall effort on climate change internationally and also nationally.
Makes a lot of sense. What about the Inflation Reduction Act? How do you perceive that's going to be impacted?
Well, my favorite word for this time with the Trump administration is just let's all have some humility, because we don't really know what will happen. I do think the fact that that Republicans control both chambers of Congress along with the White House increases the chances for significant changes to the IRA. There was a symbolic vote where all Republicans voted to repeal the IRA. That was a symbolic vote. That was a vote in the House also, just to specify. That was a symbolic vote. They knew it wouldn't pass the Senate. So if and when there is an actual vote to repeal it, we'll see how many actually back the investments that are happening in their districts. There was a letter sent by 18 House Republicans to Trump urging him to keep certain provisions of the IRA. I do think some provisions are more at risk than others. The electric vehicle tax credit is likely at risk. It has gotten caught up in the culture wars on the campaign trail. as has wind and perhaps offshore wind. So I think the IRA in general is at risk, but I would say it's more a scalpel approach as opposed to a pitchfork in terms of getting rid of it altogether. But, I just want to emphasize I don't really know, and I don't think most people really know. I don't think Trump really knows, until we get closer to the debates happening in Congress. But he has said he will rescind unspent money in the IRA. That's geared more toward grants and loans as opposed to tax credits, which are, it depends on when people apply for them. So, I do think it's going to be injecting a significant amount of uncertainty into the investment cycle. And that is something that we will be watching closely at Cipher. We have a clean tech tracker that I would encourage all of your listeners to go to, where we're tracking investments in a lot of these new technologies.
Very cool. We'll definitely link to that tracker in the show notes. And now bringing it back to Cipher, what is your vision for Cipher as it continues to grow and also over these next few years?
Yeah, well, Cipher was launched in 2021 as a newsletter, and was supported by Breakthrough Energy, which is a clean energy organization founded by Bill Gates. And we're really being supported by Breakthrough as an education initiative, how it's really important to educate the world on the climate solutions we need and also the climate solutions that may not work. And so that's sort of the origin story with Cipher. And since launching in 2021, we have gradually grown to now have 4 additional journalists, including myself, and then 2 editors. And we're really very global in nature because climate change, as we might have understood already, is a very global problem. And so we have members of our team all over the world and a lot of travel to places like Asia and South America. And of course, we have our Europe correspondent I mentioned. And so we're really laser focused, covering climate solutions from a dispassionate, pragmatic perspective. And that's really important because people can have strong opinions on these topics, but we really just cover it as the facts indicate they are. One good example of that is we had a data visualization, a chart documenting Trump's positions on energy and climate that we published right upon, hours after his election victory, after election day. And it went gangbusters online because people were hungry for easy to digest factual news about his positions. There was a million analyses of what this might mean, and they ran thousands of words long. But really, at that point in time, people just wanted the facts in an easy to digest way. And that's one way that Cipher can contribute to the news ecosystem.
Looks like we're going to have to link that to the show notes as well. And you mentioned, so you have a global team, and also have like 2 editors, 4 journalists, including yourself. So how do you like balance? And of course, climate tech is, like in the US over the past few years with the Inflation Reduction Act has really taken off. And then Europe has had their own policy initiatives, Asia across different countries. Like I saw you post to China launching this massive manufacturing facility for solar that can essentially serve all of Europe's capacity needs. So I'm curious, like, how do you keep track of all of these developments and on the global level? I'd just love to hear your thoughts on like how energy is evolving globally and like how Cipher manages to balance reporting across those different regions.
Yeah, well, I think the simple answer is you try to hire the best in the business. And that sounds maybe a little cheesy, but you know, it's true. We have Ankur Gurzu, who's our chief Europe correspondent, who I mentioned was in Baku for us this year. We have Amina Saeed in Washington, D.C., who just always has her finger on the pulse of what's happening in DC. We have Kat Clifford, who is a rock star from CNBC that we lured away. She covers a lot of the startups and the science of the matter. Bill Spindle, he and I worked together back in the day at the Wall Street Journal. He's sort of our roving global correspondent. as we're recording this, he's in South America at the moment. And I mentioned them, and I want to name drop them all because they are the ones that keep up on the things that we need to be informed on. And they all have a different perspective on the world. Bill has spent many years in the Middle East and Japan. And having that expertise from around the world is really how we stay on top of everything. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our just absolutely essential editors, Jillian Mock and Margaret Pressler, who just really make everything work and keep things on time. And it is a teamwork. I started this. I remember when we launched in September 2021, it was just me. And that is crazy to think that now we have this whole team. And it's really showing in the work that we're producing. And we also have freelancers we're working with now that enable us to have an even more global footprint. We have freelancers with expertise in China and somebody based in Mumbai, India. And that's essential because this is a global problem. And because we're mission driven and philanthropically supported, we're able to cover the stories that we know are important, not necessarily the ones that will get the most clicks. Sometimes we get a lot of traffic, but that's not our primary driver. And that's an important thing that we keep track of here.
Yeah, I was asking because as I was looking on the website, I was like, wow, there's so much output here and it's global. And then you mentioned having six like full-time people on the team. I was just thinking, wow, how are they able to put out all of that output between the six of them across so many diverse geographies? And just found it really interesting. And also, I'm curious about the breakthrough connection. So I have had a few people, really incredible people, big fan of Breakthrough on the podcast. Um, and I imagine having that connection probably enables a lot of access, just given the incredible innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, why don't I? Yeah, it does. Let me just step step further to talk about sort of the connection. And one sort of North Star we have in terms of how we operate is a healthcare news outlet called Kaiser Health News, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's in the healthcare space, so it may not be, but it was founded by a foundation for explanatory healthcare coverage. And although it operates independently, there's still cross-section of expertise that happens between the two organizations. And that's how Cipher operates with Breakthrough. So yes, certainly we talk with experts at the organization, but also CEOs of some of the companies that are in the portfolio for Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And we certainly talk to them. We do treat them just like any other sources. And there's a mutual understanding that the reason why Cipher is valuable as a journalism outlet is because we're independent. But certainly we can get the executives of many of these companies on the phone if that's something we're working on. And so it's a really, really important symbiotic relationship. At the same time, they understand, and I understand that there's this independent nature that is really important.
And I've recently been interviewing a few people who focus on climate communications. And one approach that they've highlighted as authentic to themselves, but also that they think has been effective is trying to bring climate to the conversation in a way that it's relatable to like everyday issues such as like clean air or like public health, how it impacts public health, or like also how it impacts kitchen table conversations in terms of like costs for food and things around those lines. Really curious to understand like how you are able to focus on being really objective, um, and then at the same time uh, just like bring awareness to the climate problem. Like how do you think about that?
Certainly, it is something we think about a lot. And, it's no secret that it's going to be an increasing point of conversation with President Trump in office. I think that's sort of calling out the elephant in the room. So we do it carefully and intentionally. I'm also very mindful to say that Cipher acknowledges climate change is a big problem and needs to be addressed. And that is something we take as fact. Not everybody in the world thinks that. I'm not sure if, from what we've heard, President Trump doesn't think that. But it is something that we take as fact, and that is something that we will continue to be very clear, but also dispassionate about. At the same time, I try not to use words like climate crisis, not because I don't think climate change is causing a lot of crises, but because the word has become very closely associated with advocacy groups, and we don't want to be considered an advocate of action on climate change because we're not. We're journalists doing our part through journalism to address climate change. Now, that's a nuanced point. I could see critics think may quibble with the fact that there is no difference, but I respectfully think that there is. And so when we do our coverage, and I've had this conversation with our team, that I want to respect and I want to respect anybody's personal opinions about any politician, including President Trump, but that we have to cover this administration like any other administration. And, we'll have challenges just like, anybody does. But it is something that's really important because trust and dispassionate are important components of journalism that people will read.
So climate technologies are like quite complex in a sense, and sometimes can be really technical. And Cipher does a lot of reporting on technologies and somewhat technical topics. How do you approach making these topics sort of like interesting to a more general audience, if that is an aim of Cipher?
Yeah, well, certainly, it definitely is a top interest of ours to try to make these complex technology topics relatable to a broader audience. I will also just say as an addendum, Cipher's focus is not just technology. It's all climate solutions, which is often, but not only technology. I think if technology was our only hurdle, we probably would have solved this a long time ago, but there's a lot of other factors that go into that. So just that as an aside. So I would say I'll answer the question about audience first and then go do a specific example. On our audience, we really see our audience in three key parts. One are decision makers and leaders in governments around the world, chiefly the United States and Europe, first and foremost, but ultimately, long term, we hope to be reaching all government leaders because, as we've said, this is a global problem. And then our second core audience is really all the entities, companies, investors, innovators, academics that operate around the systems that can address climate change. And so reaching those people, the sort of secondary level after government. And then our third sort of after those first two, which are our primary ones, the third one would be this catch-all audience target of the climate concerned public. One thing, though, that I want to emphasize, that even though those are our target audiences, every time we write a story, hydrogen is a good example of a topic that is pretty complicated. And I remember one time one of my reporters said, "Oh, do we need to define electrolyzer?" This was about, a year after the term had become commonplace among the energy industry. And I told her that, yes, we have to always define electrolyzer because although the topic is very known to us because we're living and breathing it every day, for the member of Congress who just got elected last year, she probably doesn't, she may not know what an electrolyzer is, and we want to reach her. So our writing, even though it's about complex topics, we're reaching an audience that are very smart and senior, but they may not know about the topics we're writing about. So I always say, when in doubt, go simpler than what you're writing, because I think we need to assume people know less than we may think they do. And if I can just offer a specific example about that, I wrote an article about how it was about carbon management and how, in terms of emitting carbon emissions, how can we clean that up, whether it's through carbon capture or direct air capture. And the headline was something like, "Carbon is the trash of our climate change era," meaning we can't see carbon dioxide emissions, but they are a waste product and we have to do something with them. So I actually learned about the trash industry, and I learned, how does the trash industry make a business out of taking our stuff away? And so that, and the illustration we had to go along with it was, trash cans that said CO2 on them. So that helps people go, oh, okay, I should think about carbon dioxide emissions as a waste product, even though right now we don't, because it's not built into our economic system. So that's just one example about how I try to simplify complex topics for a wide audience.
That's amazing. And yeah, that's learning about the trash industry. Who would have thought that learning about climate? I mean, there is some parallel there, but it's really cool that you did that. Have you noticed any shifts in your audience's priorities or engagement over time? For example, are there certain types of stories or issues within the clean energy transition or in climate solutions more broadly that resonate more strongly now compared to when Cipher first launched?
Well, I would say some sort of up and coming technologies have really gotten a lot of attention. I would say two off the top of my head: fusion and geologic hydrogen are topics that I think in 2021 was just not discussed that much. Certainly, they were in some corners of the debate, but not quite as mainstream as they are now. And I anticipate that to continue. Those are, President Trump has been supportive of fission nuclear power in the past. So I anticipate that to be a potential area of support going forward. And geologic hydrogen is just a fascinating concept. It really, it's been written about relatively extensively that we're underway a new gold rush for hydrogen underneath the earth. So that's another really interesting area as well. And I think we're entering an era where coverage of how the energy transition and, clean energy investments, whether this next administration will obviously be a top topic of interest to our readers.
Amy, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really, really informative. I appreciate you sharing all of your insights. Now, I'd like to slightly shift gears to wrap things up, to talk a little bit more about some of your personal career growth advice, insights. And we have a lot of listeners who are people who are entering the field or who are kind of just starting out in the field and have worked in the field for a few years, or people who also want to enter the field, whether that's climate specifically or just journalism generally, and would love to hear some advice that you might have as someone who's worked in the space for the last, I think maybe 15 years plus. Is there any piece of advice that you would give to aspiring journalists passionate about climate and energy reporting? Should they learn about the trash industry? Maybe.
Yeah, well, I've said this a few other times in our conversation, but it bears repeating because it is central to sort of my ethos as a human, which is just to be humble about what you don't know and what you think you want. I think an exciting career in journalism and energy climate journalism in particular can be done in a lot of different ways. For me, I went from the National Journal, which is a DC-based publication, to the Wall Street Journal, which was a very, very easy move to make. Of course, when the Wall Street Journal knocks at your door, you say yes. But then, Axios approached me, and I was very hesitant to leave a well-known quantity for Axios. But I decided to take the leap. And, somebody told me afterwards, as I was on an impromptu vacation, this woman I met, she said, take risks. Now is the time to take risks. And I was able to take a risk. It ended up being a very good risk because Axios is a very, very good media company. I loved working there. And I didn't want to leave there when Breakthrough Energy approached me about launching Cipher. But that's the thing. Opportunities don't come at the exact perfect time in life. And so I took another leap, and there's been some challenges and some amazing accomplishments over the last 3 years. And so I guess weaved in there is this idea to remain humble, because if I had a very specific focus of what I wanted to do, I probably would have not taken this job. And I'm so happy that I did. And the same thing about um, just embracing opportunities as they come and having a fluid path to success, I think is important. A lot of people have in their minds, oh, I want to work at the New York Times and be on CNN or things like that. And the landscape of media is drastically changing these days. And so those are just two things: sort of be humble and be open to opportunities that you didn't entertain, I think are two things to keep in mind. And then very specifically, me learning about the trash industry is really a larger, it's an example of a larger trend, which is to always be a learner. And that's what drew me to climate change and energy coverage in general, because I'm constantly learning things. And then now really focused in on climate solutions, I'm constantly learning new things. And so having a learning mind would be very important for any type of job like this.
Amazing. And I'm someone who's honestly obsessed with learning about how people have evolved throughout their careers and how opportunities have come about. So you mentioned you were at the Wall Street Journal, and then Axios um, sort of approached you with an opportunity. Similarly, Breakthrough did while you were at Axios. Like, how did those happen? And then part B to the question, somewhat similar, is so do you find that your career has been like shaped by like small incremental changes, as in like small incremental stories that you feel like help build your brand up? Or are there any particular like inflection moments that have occurred?
Yeah, well, answering both those questions is actually answering them in tandem. Is that, yes, that I was approached in all of those instances, which I think is a little bit unusual for non-journalism jobs, because in jobs where your work isn't constantly displayed for the public viewing, there has to be more vetting, more normal sort of, you apply for a job and then you go through that process. With journalism, it's like my resume is updated every day I publish. So it's very different if you're more behind the scenes. So I want to recognize the uniqueness of journalism in that respect. And then to sort of, so in that respect, every story I write is sort of adding to my resume. I certainly have a small list of stories that I enjoyed most, but then oftentimes those stories didn't match up with what the media sphere reacted to the most positively. An example is, in 2015, I broke the news when I was at the Wall Street Journal that then President Obama was going to reject the Keystone XL pipeline. And I broke it by 5 minutes, which is silly, really. But there's a whole media world that operates and thrives off these scoops. And I remember I got an email from an editor at Bloomberg at the time who said, "Congrats on breaking the news." And yeah, everybody at the time knew that I broke it, and it was by 5 minutes. And then fast forward to a story I had at Axios where I broke the news about this meeting that Pope Francis, was meeting with oil and finance executives. That was a more interesting story to me, because it wouldn't have happened had I not published it. And so that didn't get as much of a splash as the Keystone News did. And so, there's what the media world reacts to positively, and then there's the more nuanced, rich stories. And I'm more of the latter kind. So at Cipher, we break some news. It's not what we do most of the time. We try to break more conceptual scoops and other things like that. And I think that's now because the media space is so saturated with breaking news, that we try to do the richer analysis for our readers. So yeah, that's, that this is the great thing about journalism, is that you're only as good as your last story, and we're constantly writing. And so it keeps the job inquiries flowing, because you're constantly showing people what you're up to.
I think it was owe to the fact that you're an avid runner and people can keep up with your pace, that you're able to beat them by 5 minutes.
Definitely. Although my secret is I'm actually a pretty slow runner. I'm just very consistent. Like I always run, but I don't run very fast.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. I learned so much from our conversation. I know others will as well. And grateful for you taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.